Welcome. We're going to talk through how to request a deviation today. So here we are at the start of the deviation request workflow. Why would you use a deviation request? This would be if there's some instance that comes up where you want to do something that's different than what the SOP says, or need to do something that isn't covered by SOPs at all. In that case, you'd ask for a deviation. The deviation's approved at either your supervisor's level or by the service AD and the client. For deviations that are substantial, we do need to get the client's approval. So that'll involve Rob calling the client or emailing the client and getting their approval for doing the deviation. So first I want to show you the screen that you'll see when you select Request a Deviation. It's over here in the workflows. You might not see all of these. Certain people can see certain ones, but you should be able to see the Request a Deviation. And this is the screen that you'll see when you open it up. It says deviation request. This workflow is used to request a deviation from an established method, procedure, or policy. Supervisors approve slight deviations, while the service AD and the client need to approve any deviation more than slight. Watch for emails from Qualtrics regarding the status of your request. This is really important to watch for these emails because that's the only way you're going to find out if your deviation was approved or not, is via an email. You won't get anything in Qualtrics itself. So then you go through and fill in the information it asks for. What groups are affected by the deviation? Granted, you could justify all groups being affected by every deviation, but just go for selecting the groups that are most affected by the deviation. And then you type in your requested deviation. Try and include some policies or procedures or SOPs that you know the deviation is from. That will help in the approval process, and it'll help your supervisor in determining whether it's a slight or not slight deviation. And then as we scroll down, you list out the cases that would be affected by the deviation. This is important because the cases that would be affected by the deviation, they all need to have some kind of documentation put in the VGL admin record that the deviation was done and that the deviation was approved, and sometimes what the deviation entailed. If you used a different extraction method that doesn't have an SOP, then you may need to put in the details of that extraction method down to the step-by-step instructions. So we need to know which cases were affected so that we can make sure their case records are updated with the information. And then you select the appropriate supervisor. This is the supervisor that is going to make the determination of whether it's a slight or not slight deviation. So you want to choose a supervisor that makes the most sense to choose for that. So after you've entered all of that information about this deviation that you want to do, then you hit the Submit Request button at the bottom. Here's the overview of the deviation request. So if the deviation request is slight, it's going to focus on this side of the flow. And if it's not slight, it will focus on the other side of the flow. Let's go ahead and start with a slight deviation. So you've made your deviation request to your supervisor, and they look at the deviation request and determine that it's slight. So you'll receive an email that says that the slight deviation is approved, and then the supervisor chooses somebody to document that slight deviation. So they go into each of the affected case files and add a VGL comment or a document archive file detailing what the deviation is. If the deviation includes several changed steps in an SOP or something like that, make sure those changes are reflected in the case. So that's why the document archive is helpful, is because you can just type up absolutely everything that's been changed in a Word file or something, and attach that in Document Archive. And then once it's all been documented, the deviation is closed out in Qualtrics. So if the deviation is not slight, we're focused over here on this side. And the supervisor determines that it's not slight mainly by thinking about the deviation and whether they would want the client's approval to pursue it. Something like doing a completely different extraction procedure that we haven't ever done before, but the sample is such that it seems to be the best solution for maybe a really limited sample or a sample type we're not used to dealing with, but we really want to be able to give them results. Something like that. As a supervisor, you would think that, well, I really should talk to the client and make sure they're on board with this before we go ahead because it's going to damage their sample or something like that. So just to give a little help to supervisors when they're making this call of is it slight or is it not, if it's something that you would really feel more comfortable if you knew the client was on board with, then it's not slight, and send that through to the service associate director. So if you determine it's not slight, it goes on to the service associate director. Well, first off, they need to agree that the deviation is approved. If they don't, they deny it and it gets closed out. But if they do approve it, then they have to contact the client, because we can't move forward with these big deviations until we get the client's approval. So the service AD will call or email the client and gain their approval. If they don't approve, then we're back here with denying and closing out the deviation. But if they do approve, then we're going to move on to this last step, and this is assigned to the analysis supervisor. And that's because one of the things that's required for a deviation is that you need to include a disclaimer in the report regarding that deviation, that it was done and what it was. And we're comfortable with this in that the client already knows what the deviation is because they've already approved it, so they won't be surprised by seeing it in the report. So one thing that the service AD does to help out the analysis supervisor is that they provide them with some suggested modified wording for the report, so that they can just input that into the report in the custom wording spot and move forward with it without too much thought or angst. Another thing I wanted to point out is that when these get denied, either by a supervisor or by the service AD, you aren't left in limbo. You've obviously asked for this deviation request and it's been denied. So either the supervisor or the service AD need to provide you with some instructions on where to go and what to do now that they've denied your request to deviate. So you aren't left high and dry. You do get some instructions from them on how to proceed. And another thing about this workflow is that this is the only workflow in Qualtrics that is really in real time. You're submitting this deviation request with work piling up like right there. Your sample is waiting on the supervisor and the service AD and the client sometimes in order to move forward with this deviation. One of the things I've done is that any of the email reminders or notifications that you get will have alert as part of the subject line, so that it will hopefully pop a bit in your view as you're monitoring your email during the day. And that will also allow you to set up rules in Outlook or whatever mail client you use to sort these emails into a location that you pay a lot of attention to. Because I do realize at the beginning of getting all of these policies out, you're getting flooded with emails. But these deviation requests do need to be handled in real time. So they're tagged with a special text to allow you to see that easily. So we're going to jump into the middle of this request a deviation workflow. This is a test deviation, not a real one. But where we're jumping in is that this deviation's been deemed slight by the analysis supervisor, and she's asked Stephen to look into making sure all the affected cases are documented with the deviation. So this is what Stephen sees. He sees kind of a recounting of what to do, what you can do to document these things. You can use VHL comments, you can use document archive, any way to get the information into the case record. He's given some background information, what the deviation was, what the cases were affected by it, any comments from a supervisor or the service associate director, and then the date the deviation information was added to affected cases. That would be active for Stephen, but since I'm not Stephen, it's not active for me, but it is required. It indicates the little required there. So that's the field that Stephen's going to fill in. So we're going to jump into a more major deviation. This one was deemed not slight by Jen during our little test run here. And so right now this is sitting in Rob's inbox. So just like Stephen's inbox, I'm not Rob, so you'll see the little required symbols for the areas that Rob's going to need to fill in. But it's not active for me because I'm not Rob. So they're going to go in and determine what direction this deviation is going to go. They may reclassify this deviation as slight, in which case they'll pick somebody to document the slight deviation and then it'll go forward. Or they may determine that they need to contact the client and gain their approval for the deviation, or they may decide to deny the deviation. So that's the three areas that Rob's going to determine for this somewhat major deviation. So here, if Rob determines that the deviation was actually slight and didn't need to come to him, then he would need to assign somebody and give them some comments regarding the deviation so they understand why it's getting put back to them as a slight deviation. If they do determine that they need to contact the client, then they do so and put in the date here that they contacted the client. And then they can deny the deviation. This is done if either they decide to deny it or the client denies the change. Either way it gets denied, and in that case they're prompted to give instructions to the group supervisor on how to proceed since the deviation was denied.